He opened his door to a freezing night and found a woman with hollow eyes and 2 children clinging to her coat. He offered them shelter, nothing more. But what he didn't know was that one small act of kindness would lead him to the most unexpected courtroom in his life, and a judge who would stand in stunned silence the moment she heard his name. Before we begin this unforgettable story of grace healing and love born from the ashes, make sure to subscribe so you never miss another story that just might stay with you long after it ends. Now let me take you back to where it all began. The wind howled low through the pine trees like a morning song, dragging behind it a sharp chill that pressed against the wooden walls of Luke Whitaker's cabin. The first snow of the season was falling harder, now thick, stubborn flakes landing on the windows like small, quiet knocks. Inside, the fire cracked with the soft sigh of dry cedar, and the kettle on the stove let out a whisper of steam. Luke leaned against the kitchen counter, fingers wrapped around a chipped mug of black coffee. He watched the snow, his eyes heavy, not from lack of sleep, but from the kind of exhaustion that sits behind the ribs where grief lives. His daughter Ellie was curled up on the couch with a book too big for her small hands. She was 8, going on 80, wise-eyed, too quiet, too still, since the accident that took her mother 2 winters ago. Luke hadn't heard her laugh in nearly a year, and he feared he might never hear it again. Then came a different kind of knock, 3 slow raps, hesitant like someone wasn't sure if they wanted to be heard. Luke stiffened. He wasn't expecting anyone. Not tonight. Not ever, really. He set the mug down, walked to the door, and opened it cautiously, the cold rushing in like a memory he hadn't invited. What he saw would become the hinge of everything that came after. A woman stood on the porch, her coat soaked through with sleet. Her hair clung to her face in wet strands, and in her arms she held a little girl no older than 5. Behind her, another child, older, maybe 7, clutched her coat with trembling fingers. "I'm sorry," the woman said, her voice barely above a whisper. "I didn't mean to bother you. The truck died. We were trying to find shelter for the night. I thought this place looked safe." Luke's eyes moved past her to the battered pickup truck, parked crooked at the edge of the clearing, its hood steaming under a blanket of snow. No engine ticking. No lights. He didn't answer right away. He studied her face, pale drawn but not defeated. Her hands were shaking, but she kept them wrapped tight around the child in her arms. Something about her posture stirred an old instinct in him, the one that used to wake up before the alarm when he was a firefighter. That part of him, the man who once ran toward flames, was still in there, somewhere buried beneath the ashes of loss. "You have anywhere else to go?" he asked finally. She shook her head, and he noticed then her boots weren't even zipped. One of the laces had snapped. "No family?" he asked. "Not anymore." A beat of silence. Then another gust of wind howled through the trees, and the little girl in her arms whimpered. Luke stepped back and opened the door wider. "Come in," he said simply. The woman hesitated. "You sure?" she asked, and for the first time he saw her eyes green, glassy but alert. Protective. "I wouldn't be standing here if I wasn't," Luke said. "Get those kids inside before their toes freeze." They shuffled in with quiet gratitude. The older child, thin pale, with eyes like storm clouds, carried a threadbare backpack. Luke pointed toward the fire. "Warm up," he said. "I'll get towels." By the time they peeled off their wet layers and sat huddled on the rug, steam rising from their sleeves, Luke had already filled the kettle again. "I'm Luke," he said, offering the woman a fresh mug. "My daughter's Ellie. She's shy. Don't take it personal." The woman nodded, clutching the mug like it held her breath inside. "Mara," she said. "And these are my daughters, Leah and June." He nodded once, then took a seat across from her. No one said anything for a long time. The only sound was the wind against the window, and the faint hum of something shifting in the air, like the course of a river, quiet but sure. Luke didn't know it yet, but tonight would be the first night he slept without dreaming of fire. And in the kitchen drawer beneath an old notepad and some rusted nails lay a memento. Luke hadn't touched in years, a scorched red handkerchief saved from the last rescue he ever made. The one that had never left his mind. The one he thought was finished. The cabin was never loud, but now it felt quieter than usual. Not the peaceful kind, the kind that pressed against the walls like an unspoken question. Luke moved about the kitchen with the steady rhythm of someone used to doing everything himself, heating soup, slicing bread, filling mugs. He didn't ask questions. Not yet. He'd learned that some truths need warmth and time before they're willing to come out. Mara sat on the floor by the fireplace, her back straight, despite her exhaustion. Leah and June had curled up in a nest of Ellie's old blankets, fast asleep before the soup even cooled. Ellie sat on the armchair across the room, hugging her knees, her eyes fixed on the flicker of the flames. She hadn't said a word since they arrived, but she hadn't walked away either, a quiet gesture of acceptance at least for now. Luke set a bowl of chicken noodle soup in front of Mara and pulled a chair up close enough to talk far enough not to intrude. She murmured a soft thank you and took a sip. Her hands were still shaking. He studied her face in the firelight. The shadows deepened the hollows of her cheeks, but her eyes stayed sharp, alert, not afraid. Just watching the way a deer watches a clearing before stepping into it. "You from around here?" he asked gently. She shook her head. 3 towns over. We've been moving. How long? She hesitated. Since July, that was 4 months. 4 months of moving with 2 children and no home. Luke tried to imagine it, and failed. He took a slow breath. "You don't owe me your story," he said. "But if there's someone looking for you..." "There isn't." She cut in a little too quickly, then softened. "There's no one left." That was all she said, and all she needed to. Luke nodded, and silence returned, this time a shared one. The next morning, Luke rose before the sun, the way grief had trained him to do. He split wood out by the shed, breath misting in the cold air, trying not to think too hard. Mara had stayed on the couch all night with her girls, refusing the room he offered. Ellie had slept beside him, tucked in close the way she used to when she was little. When he returned inside, the smell of coffee surprised him. Mara stood barefoot in the kitchen, hair tied back, wearing one of Ellie's oversized sweatshirts. She moved around the stove like she'd always known it, measuring coffee grounds with a quiet confidence. "I hope you don't mind," she said without turning. "I found the kettle." He didn't, not even close. "It's usually just me," he said. "Ellie's not much of a cook." Mara gave a small smile. "Then I guess I'll earn my keep." "You don't owe me anything," Luke replied almost too quickly. "I know," she said. "That's why I want to." She set a mug in front of him. Black coffee, no sugar, exactly how he drank it. He didn't ask how she knew. Over the next few days, the cabin changed, not in structure, but in energy. The silence that used to echo became warm, shared. Ellie, once mute around strangers, began sitting closer to the fireplace, where Leah and June played. She even handed Leah a small stuffed bear she hadn't touched in months. Mara took over the kitchen, naturally, never overstepping, never assuming, but always with something warm on the stove, always humming softly as she worked. Luke didn't remember the last time his home had smelled like cinnamon and apples. He began noticing things. How Mara would rub her wrist when she thought no one was watching, as if easing an old injury. How she slept lightly, waking at the smallest sound. How she checked on her girls 3 times each night, tiptoeing barefoot like a ghost of worry. She was carrying more than a backpack of clothes and a pair of hungry kids. One evening, as snow tapped gently against the window, Luke found her standing on the porch, looking up at the moon. He joined her, handing over a cup of tea. "You planning to leave soon?" he asked. Not accusing, just curious. Mara looked down at her feet. "I don't know. I didn't plan to stay." But she exhaled. But Leah smiled today. A real one. June didn't ask if we're moving tomorrow, and I paused, swallowing. I didn't feel like I was surviving. Just living. Luke looked at her, and something unspoken passed between them. "You and your girls have a place here," he said. "For as long as you need." She didn't thank him. Instead, she blinked fast and nodded once, as if any more would break the quiet spell between them. Later that night, after the kids had gone to bed, Luke pulled out an old drawer in the living room cabinet. Inside, among mismatched screws and a worn-out flashlight, was a folded red handkerchief, its edges singed, its center still marked with soot. He hadn't touched it in years. Didn't know why he kept it, except that it reminded him he had once done something that mattered. Something brave. Before the world fell apart. He turned it over in his hand, then tucked it back. Behind him, Mara stirred in her sleep on the couch, murmuring a name he couldn't quite hear. The days grew shorter, and the snow lingered longer on the roof of the cabin, coating it like a blanket that refused to be shaken off. Luke found himself walking more quietly, listening more intently, as though the stillness of the house demanded reverence. It wasn't just the sound of winter he listened for. It was Mara's voice humming in the kitchen, the soft patter of Leah's feet on the wooden floor, or Ellie whispering to June over a puzzle by the fire. All of it was new. All of it was not what he was used to. One morning, he stood at the back window with a mug in hand, staring out at the line of trees that marked where his world had ended 3 years ago, and where somehow it had begun again. He didn't understand how or why, only that it was happening. Mara was folding laundry on the sofa, humming an old folk tune under her breath. Luke didn't know the song, but something about it felt familiar, like something his mother used to play on the radio when he was a boy. "Where'd you learn that?" he asked. She paused, blinking. "Oh, this. My grandmother sang it when we were little. We didn't have much, but she always said you could sing warmth into a cold day." Luke gave a soft smile. "She sounds like someone who knew things." "She did," Mara said, eyes darkening slightly. "But she couldn't save everyone." That final sentence hung in the air like breath on glass. Luke didn't press. He understood that line, the invisible boundary people draw between what they share and what they survive. Later that afternoon, Mara stepped outside with Luke to help bring in firewood. The sun was low, casting long shadows across the snow. They worked in easy silence, stacking logs onto the sled Luke used to drag wood back to the porch. As she reached for another piece, her sleeve lifted, and Luke saw it, a faint scar running from her wrist to her elbow. Not fresh, but unmistakably deep. She noticed his glance and pulled her sleeve down quickly. "Kitchen accident," she said too casually. Luke didn't reply. He knew that tone, the one people used when they wanted to close a door without slamming it. He respected it. But that night, after the girls had gone to bed, Mara stayed by the fire longer than usual. She cradled her tea but didn't drink it. "Do you ever wonder," she said slowly, "how some people remember pain so clearly, and others seem to forget everything that matters?" Luke turned to her, uncertain where the question was headed. I mean, she continued her gaze, lost in the flames. Some people survive horrible things, and they carry it with them every day. Others walk away like nothing happened, and the ones who hurt them get to live like saints. He let the silence stretch. Then he said, "I used to think forgetting was the cruelest thing. Now I think maybe carrying it is worse." Mara turned her head toward him. Her expression softened like a tightly held knot finally easing. "I lost someone," she said. "My husband. He died slow. Cancer. But before that, I lost him long before the sickness. He wasn't kind. Not to me. Not to our girls. Luke didn't flinch, didn't look away. He just nodded. No one believed me, she said. His family thought I was exaggerating, said I was unstable, emotional, and when he passed, they saw me as the problem to be solved, not the widow to be helped. She laughed once dryly. So I packed what I could, took my kids, and started driving. I didn't know where I was going. Just away. Luke stirred in his seat. I'm sorry, he said. Not because it was what people say, but because he meant it. Mara shrugged. We've been sleeping in shelters, parking lots, sometimes a cheap motel if I could find a day's work. I kept thinking one more week, one more turn of the map. She looked around the cabin. But then we found this place, and you. Luke didn't know what to say. His chest ached with the weight of understanding. There were different kinds of fires in this world, and she had escaped one just as dangerous as the ones he used to fight. He reached into the drawer beside his chair, the one he hadn't opened in years. From it, he pulled out the scorched red handkerchief and held it in his hand. I know about carrying things, he said. 15 years ago, I pulled a woman out of a building that was caving in. Last call of my career. I blew out my back doing it. Never saw her face. She was unconscious when I carried her out. But I kept this. He lifted the handkerchief slightly. It was wrapped around her wrist. Mara leaned forward. Did she ever come back to thank you? Luke shook his head. No. And I never looked for her. I told myself it didn't matter, that I was just doing my job. But it did matter, Mara said gently. He nodded. It did. Still does. They sat in the firelight, the weight of their pasts gently settling between them like shared snow. Neither reached for the other. Neither made promises. But something had shifted, like two broken timbers leaning into one another to carry the weight they couldn't hold alone. And upstairs, in the quiet of a child's room, Ellie finally whispered to Leah the name of her favorite stuffed bear. The days unfolded with a kind of gentle rhythm that Luke had almost forgotten could exist. Morning coffee, laughter from the girls, the smell of bread rising in the kitchen. It was not dramatic, not cinematic, but it was real, and it was enough. Luke began noticing how the small things in his home had shifted without him planning it. A pair of tiny boots by the door, a braid of garlic hung by the window, a child's drawing of 5 stick figures taped to the fridge, 4 with smiles and 1 with a crooked line across its mouth that Ellie later whispered was Dad when he's pretending not to smile. It was Ellie who surprised him most. She started reading aloud to June and Leah by the fireplace, her voice soft and careful, like she was learning how to speak again. She let Mara braid her hair one evening, something even her grandmother couldn't coax her to allow after her mother died. And yet, even as warmth slowly returned to the cabin, Luke knew better than to trust a thaw too quickly. He'd lived through too many winters to forget that sometimes the softest snow hid the hardest ice. One afternoon, Luke returned from town with a bag of supplies and found a beige sedan parked awkwardly at the edge of his drive. An unfamiliar woman stood stiffly on the porch, her fur-lined coat pristine and entirely unsuited for country snow. Mara was inside, frozen mid-step, her lips drawn tight. The woman turned when Luke approached. She was in her late 50s, thin-lipped and sharp-eyed, the kind of person whose jewelry whispered money and judgment in equal measure. "You must be Mr. Whitaker," she said, extending a gloved hand. "I am," he said, setting down the bag without taking it. "I'm Evelyn Brooks. I'm the sister-in-law of Mara's late husband." Luke nodded, expression unreadable. "I've been trying to locate her for months. When she stopped answering our calls, we grew concerned." Mara stood behind the screen door, unmoving. "She's been safe here," Luke said simply. "Safe," Evelyn echoed dryly. "With a strange man in a cabin in the woods." Luke's jaw tightened. "She's not a prisoner. If she wants to leave, she's free to go. Evelyn turned her gaze to Mara. We're not here to fight, dear. But you took those girls and disappeared. That's not how custody works. Legally, the family has rights. The girls are mine, Mara said, quietly, finally stepping out. I never signed anything that gives you authority over them. You also never filed for guardianship or a permanent residence. That's called instability. They're healthy, happy. Ask them if they want to go with you, Luke interjected. That's enough. This isn't a courthouse. Not yet, Evelyn said, eyes narrowing. But it will be. She handed Mara a sealed envelope, her smile tight. Consider this a courtesy before we make things formal. With that, she turned and left her boots clicking over the frozen ground. Mara stood in the doorway long after the car disappeared down the road. Her hands trembled as she held the letter. That night, the cabin's warmth felt thinner somehow. Ellie curled up with her bear closer than usual. Leah was unusually quiet. June kept asking if they were leaving again. Luke found Mara outside on the steps, the cold biting into her sweater sleeves. She's bluffing, he said, sitting down beside her. Mara shook her head. No, she has money. Connections. And I've got, what, a beat-up truck, a notebook full of half-jobs, no permanent address, no lawyer. You've got me. She turned to him, startled. Luke, I'm not saying I can fix it, but I'm not going to let you face it alone. Mara blinked fast. I can't ask that of you. You didn't ask, he said. I offered. She looked away, voice cracking. They'll say I'm unstable, that I ran away, that I lived with a stranger. Then we show them the truth. She gave a bitter smile. Truth doesn't matter in court. Paper does. Luke paused, then asked gently, Do you want to fight? Yes, she whispered, more than anything. But I'm so tired of losing. Luke didn't speak. He just took her hand. For the first time since she arrived, she didn't pull away. The next morning, he drove her into town and introduced her to a local legal aid attorney, a retired judge named Mr. Harlan, who worked out of a trailer behind the gas station. He listened carefully as Mara spoke, then rubbed his chin and said, You've got a hard road ahead, but not impossible. Judges care about stability, yes, but they care more about well-being. Letters from teachers, neighbors, the pediatrician, those help. And if you can prove that the environment you're in now is loving and safe, he glanced at Luke. It could make a difference. Mara left with a list of documents, a long breath of worry, and something she hadn't carried in months, hope. That evening the fire burned steady. Ellie and Leah braided yarn bracelets, their laughter light and unforced. Luke was chopping carrots in the kitchen when he caught Mara watching them, her expression unreadable. What he asked? She blinked. You ever think some people aren't just passing through? But we're always meant to find each other. He looked at her and smiled. Every day now. The wind was louder that morning, whipping through the trees, like it had an opinion rattling the windows, with a kind of urgency that made Luke uneasy. The cabin, usually so still, felt like it was listening for something. Mara sat at the kitchen table, a stack of papers in front of her, her hair tied back in a knot that looked tighter than it needed to be. Ellie sat beside her, coloring quietly, while Leah and June built a fort of couch cushions and blankets. Luke entered from the back door, stomping snow off his boots. In his hand was a registered envelope. He didn't say a word, just set it on the table in front of Mara. She stared at it for a long moment, then slid her finger beneath the flap, tearing it with more control than emotion. The first page read, Summons to appear before the family court of Iron County. Below that, a date, 2 weeks away. Her shoulders slumped, and the hand that held the paper trembled. They're not bluffing, she whispered. Luke pulled out a chair and sat down across from her. Then neither are we. The next few days blurred into a cycle of documentation phone calls and quiet panic. Mr. Harlan, the retired judge-turned-attorney, was kind, but blunt. The other side's got money, and lawyers, he said, adjusting his reading glasses. But that doesn't mean they have a case. We build a picture, not just of where they've been, but what kind of life those kids have now. He pointed to Mara's packet of handwritten letters from the girl's pediatrician, the church food pantry, and even Luke's old neighbor, Mrs. Carmichael, who had started dropping by with muffins and warm glances. But this, he said, tapping Luke's handwritten affidavit, this is what matters most. Luke looked up. It's just the truth, Harlan nodded. And sometimes that's more powerful than any legal precedent. Still, the odds weren't in their favor. Evelyn Brooks had a reputation for influence and money, and the court system didn't always bend toward compassion, especially when a woman with no income, no address, and no legal representation for months was trying to retain custody. One evening after the girls were asleep, Mara sat on the porch, wrapped in one of Luke's flannel shirts. The moonlight washed her face in silver, making her look older and younger all at once. I've fought for a lot of things, she said quietly, but never like this, not with so much to lose. Luke sat beside her, elbows resting on his knees. They're not just your kids anymore, he said. They're part of this place now, part of Ellie, part of me. She turned her face toward him. Do you ever wish you hadn't opened the door that night? He didn't hesitate. No, not for a second. She nodded, tears in her eyes, but not falling. I don't know how to say thank you for all of this. Luke's voice was gentle. Then don't. Just stay. Days passed. Snow piled high. The cabin was filled with the scent of soup, the murmur of bedtime stories, the quiet laughter of children learning to trust the ground beneath their feet. And then came the day before the court hearing. Luke rose early, dressed in the only suit he still owned, black, slightly outdated with shoulders he'd once filled better. Ellie stood beside him in a navy dress, clutching a small notebook. Mara emerged from the bedroom in a dark green wool coat that someone Mrs. Carmichael probably had left on the porch the week before. She looked dignified, even if her fingers fidgeted with the buttons. They drove to the courthouse in near silence, snow blowing across the road like spirits guiding their way. Luke kept one hand on the wheel and the other resting lightly on his knee, resisting the urge to reach for Mara's. When they arrived, the courthouse loomed like a fortress gray square, impersonal. Inside, the waiting room buzzed with tension. Lawyers with briefcases, families with eyes full of hope or dread. Mara sat beside Luke, her hands clasped, eyes closed. I'm not praying for a win, she whispered, just for fairness. Luke squeezed her hand. That's enough. When their case was called, they entered the courtroom, polished wood benches, high ceilings, everything meant to feel larger than life. The judge's bench was still empty. Their seats were to the left. Evelyn Brooks sat across the aisle, flanked by two attorneys and a clipboard full of exhibits. She didn't look at Mara, only at the judge's bench. Then a door opened. A woman entered in a black robe, her presence calm but commanding. Her hair was silver at the temples, pulled into a tidy twist. Her face carried lines that came from years of decision-making and probably a few nights of restless sleep. Court is now in session, the bailiff called, presiding the Honorable Judge Eleanor Grace. Mara stiffened beside Luke. Luke looked up and the judge froze, her eyes locked on his, for a moment too long. The room didn't notice, but Luke did. She blinked, nodded once, and sat. A pause, barely noticeable. But the air had shifted. Judge Eleanor Grace sat tall behind the bench, but something had changed the moment she heard the name. It was so subtle that no one else noticed the brief stillness of her hands, the way her eyes didn't immediately drop to the paperwork in front of her. But Luke noticed, and so did Mara. She composed herself quickly, clearing her throat and folding her hands. We are here today to hear the custody petition filed by Ms. Evelyn Brooks. The judge began, her voice clear and steady, requesting legal guardianship of minors, Leah and June Barrett, currently in the physical care of their biological mother, Mara Barrett. There was no flicker of recognition in the way she said Mara's name, only Luke's. Mara's hand tightened on the edge of the table. The opposing counsel, a polished man in his 40s, with a voice made for microphones, launched into a presentation about instability risk factors and concern for the well-being of the children. Evelyn Brooks nodded solemnly beside him, wearing a thin expression of righteousness. Luke watched Eleanor Grace carefully. She took notes, listened, and asked precise questions, her tone, even her posture, unwavering. But he caught it again when Evelyn mentioned that the children had been living in a makeshift cabin with a man of no familial relation. The judge's pen stopped moving. Just for a moment. Then came Mara's turn. Her voice was steady, but there was a tremor behind it, like a violin string pulled a little too tight. She spoke of what she could, the meals, the homework, the bedtime routines. She explained the jobs she had taken, the medical appointments. She'd kept the blankets she carried from town to town, hoping each night would be the last in the back seat of her truck. Luke spoke next. No theatrics, just the truth. I didn't take them in out of charity, he said quietly. I took them in because it was right, because they needed warmth, because I had a fire going, and they had nowhere else to go. He paused, locking eyes with the judge, and I've kept that fire going ever since. Something in the courtroom shifted then. It wasn't loud. It wasn't dramatic. But it was human. Even Evelyn Brooks' attorney looked down briefly, as if reminded that paper arguments could only stretch so far before cracking under the weight of reality. Eleanor Grace leaned forward slightly. Mr. Whitaker, she said slowly. May I ask, were you previously in public service? Luke nodded. Firefighter, District 6 until 2009. Her lips parted ever so slightly, then closed again. Thank you. She shuffled the documents in front of her, then turned to the petitioner. Ms. Brooks, you allege instability. Can you confirm whether the children have suffered any neglect, academic regression, or physical harm? While under their mother's care, Evelyn looked flustered. We don't have that kind of evidence. But she's living in a man's home, without legal agreement. That's not the question I asked, Eleanor said, voice firmer. Do you have evidence of harm? No, Evelyn admitted. And yet you wish to remove the children from their mother, who has by your own acknowledgement kept them healthy and safe. Eleanor looked down at a page. Then without warning she said, Let's take a brief recess. The gavel tapped once. Everyone in the room exhaled. In the hallway, Luke leaned against the wall, jaw tight. Mara sat beside him, her hands in her lap. The girls waited outside with Ellie and Mrs. Carmichael, who had shown up to offer support like only small-town folks can, with a thermos of hot cider and a heart full of loyalty. I saw it, Mara whispered. The way she looked at you. Luke nodded. I don't know what it means. Do you know her? He shook his head slowly. I don't think so. But her voice, it felt familiar. Mara tilted her head. Maybe she knows you, but not from this life. He almost smiled. Almost. Back inside, the judge took longer than expected to return. When she did, her robe slightly askew, her hair a little more undone than before. She sat in silence for a long moment. Then slowly, she turned toward Luke. Mr. Whitaker, she said, I'd like you to confirm something for the record. Did you respond to a fire on West 6th Street in April of 2009? Luke blinked. Yes, ma'am. Was that your last call? He hesitated, then nodded. It was. Eleanor exhaled, closing her eyes briefly. When she opened them, they glistened. "I was the woman in that apartment," she said. Gasps whispered around the room. "I was unconscious. I never saw your face. But I remember your voice. I remember you said, 'Don't sleep. Someone's waiting for you.' I didn't know who you were, not until today. But when you spoke, it was like a thread pulled tight across 15 years snapped back into place." Luke's face remained still, but Mara's hand found his. Eleanor straightened, her voice steadied. "This is not a courtroom for favors. It is a courtroom for truth. And today I have heard a truth that transcends documentation, money, and structure. I have heard the truth of compassion, of character, and of sacrifice." She looked at Evelyn Brooks. "You may have the right to file a petition, but you do not have the right to remove children from a home rooted in love and safety." Eleanor folded her hands. Petition denied. Silence fell again, but this time it was not empty. It was full. Of breath withheld, of hearts breaking open, of something bigger than the law. Luke turned to Mara. She was crying not out of fear, but release. For the first time, she didn't look like someone holding it together. She looked like someone finally letting go. And across the room, Judge Eleanor Grace sat with tears on her cheek, not just for the past she had survived, but for the present she had helped protect. Snow fell softly that afternoon, quieting the streets outside the courthouse, as if the sky itself knew something sacred had just occurred inside. Luke stood near the exit with Mara beside him, the girls clinging to her legs. He hadn't said much since the verdict, and neither had she. There were no words big enough to match what had been given. They stepped out into the cold, and the world was strangely still. The courthouse loomed behind them, no longer a place of fear, but of redemption, a place where justice hadn't just been done, but had been felt. Mrs. Carmichael wrapped Mara in a hug that didn't need any explanation, and gave Luke a nod, so approving it could have passed for a Medal of Honor. "I'll take the girls and Ellie ahead," she whispered to Mara. "You two. Breathe." And with that, they were alone. Luke stared out toward the parking lot, not moving. "You okay?" he asked. Mara turned toward him, then looked down at her gloves. "I didn't know I could cry like that. Not from sadness, but from something bigger." He nodded slowly. "I know." She let out a shaky breath. "Do you think she planned to say all that Judge Grace No Luke said? I think she's been carrying it just like we have, waiting for something that would make it all matter." They stood in silence a moment longer, then turned to walk toward the truck. Just before they reached it, a voice called from behind. "Mr. Whitaker." It was Judge Eleanor Grace, no longer on the bench, no longer in the robe. Just a woman now with silver-streaked hair blowing in the wind and a red scarf wrapped tight around her neck. Luke turned. Mara stayed a step behind, sensing something personal. "I didn't mean to intrude," Eleanor said, her breath visible in the cold. "But I couldn't leave without saying something more." Luke nodded, waiting. She stepped closer, her eyes shining. "After that fire, I woke up in a hospital with my daughter asleep in the chair beside me. They told me I'd been minutes away from never waking up. I asked about the firefighter who pulled me out. No one knew who you were. I think you left before they could even thank you." "I didn't stay for thanks," Luke replied gently. "I know," she said. "That's how I knew it was you. That voice, that same calm strength in the middle of chaos." She pulled something from her coat pocket, an old photograph slightly wrinkled. In it, she stood holding her daughter's hand, outside the burned building, a bandage on her forehead, soot on her cheeks. In the corner of the frame, barely visible, a man in uniform with his back to the camera walking away. She held it out. "I kept this all these years, not because it was clear, but because it was the only piece I had of the moment everything changed. Luke took the photo, studied it quietly, then returned it with reverence. "You didn't just save my life," she said. "You saved the way I chose to live it after. I left my job at the firm, applied to become a judge. I wanted to be the kind of person who could stand between others and the fire." She stepped back, emotion caught in her throat. "And today, I got to." Luke didn't respond right away. When he did, his voice was quieter than Mara had ever heard it. "I'm glad I didn't leave you there." Eleanor nodded once. "So am I." She turned to go, then hesitated. "If either of you ever need anything legal, personal, even just a cup of coffee, you call me. Not the judge, just Eleanor." She handed them a card with her personal number. Then, with one final glance, she disappeared into the snow. Back at the cabin, the fire was already lit. Mrs. Carmichael had left a tray of sandwiches on the table, and the girls were curled up on the rug, as if the courtroom had never existed. Luke stood in the doorway watching them, a quiet weight in his chest, not heavy, just full. Mara appeared beside him, brushing snow from her coat. "They look like they've been here their whole lives." "Feels like they have," Luke said. She reached into her bag and pulled out the court envelope. "It's strange, everything we've been through, and it comes down to one piece of paper." Luke took it from her and slid it into a drawer. "Let it rest," he said. She looked at him, eyes steady. "And us." He paused, not out of hesitation but reverence. "We're just beginning." That night, after the girls had gone to sleep, Luke sat on the porch, nursing a mug of tea. Mara joined him, wrapped in a quilt. No words passed between them for a long time. They didn't need to. The stars blinked above them, the woods whispered secrets in the dark, and somewhere far beyond the trees, the sound of a single owl broke the silence. "Do you think things like this happen for a reason?" Mara asked. Luke took a breath. "I don't know. But I think sometimes, when we do the right thing for someone else, life remembers." She looked over at him, eyes full of something softer than gratitude, something that lingered, something like love. And in that stillness between snow and stars, healing found its quiet home. February arrived on quiet feet. The snow was no longer fresh, but settled, packed into the contours of the land like a blanket folded by time. The storm had passed, both the literal one and the courtroom gale that had nearly swept away everything Mara held dear. But the quiet that followed wasn't empty. It pulsed with something alive, something delicate, a promise not yet spoken. Luke felt it in the way Mara stirred her tea in the mornings, thoughtfully, gently, as if she were still learning how to be still. He saw it in Ellie, who now laughed without checking the room first, and in June, and Leah, who had started arguing like sisters do when they know their roots won't be torn up the next day. Mara had begun to leave her suitcase zipped. That, to Luke, was the loudest thing of all. One crisp morning, Luke stood at the woodpile, axe in hand, splitting logs with a steady rhythm. Mara came outside carrying 2 mugs of coffee. She didn't speak, just handed him one, and sat on the edge of the porch. For a while they listened to the sound of metal against wood, of birds pecking seed from beneath the eaves of quiet that had grown comfortable. "I keep wondering," Mara said finally, "if we'd met any other way." "Would this have worked?" Luke paused mid-swing. "You mean if you weren't on my porch freezing with 2 kids?" She smiled. "Yeah, if we met, clean, polished, in a coffee shop, would we have looked at each other the same?" Luke drove the axe down one last time, then leaned it against the post. "I think we would have been polite," he said, "but we'd never have seen each other." Mara tilted her head. "And now?" "Now I see you," he said, simply. She held his gaze, and the stillness between them was no longer just quiet. It was tender. "I haven't told you something," she said, eyes drifting toward the woods. "It's not terrible. Just Mine. And I'm not sure what to do with it anymore. Luke sat beside her, warming his hands around the mug. Whatever it is, you can say it. Or not. Either way, I'll still be here tomorrow. She nodded, took a breath. The scar on my arm, it wasn't a kitchen accident. He didn't react, didn't press. I got it trying to pull my girls out of our old house when a kitchen fire broke out. It wasn't big, but the smoke was. I remember choking, crawling, screaming their names. They were in their room, and I was 2 seconds too far away. Luke's hand moved, rested lightly over hers. I got them out. But not before the neighbors came running. It was in the papers. And suddenly, I was the reckless widow, unstable, unfit. Evelyn used it to paint me like someone who shouldn't be trusted with children. Mara blinked, but no tears came. The worst part, they didn't even ask what happened before the fire, or why I was the only one who cared to get them out. Luke sat in that silence with her. I know that feeling, he said. Being blamed for doing your best. It carves something deep. But I see you, Mara, and I see your girls, and I see what you saved. She nodded slowly. Thank you for saying that, for meaning it. Later that day, the girls built a snow fort in the yard. Ellie had brought out old pots and spoons to make soup with snow and twigs, and Mara watched from the porch, her laughter ringing clearer now. Luke came out with a blanket and wrapped it around her shoulders without asking. You know, he said, there's something I didn't tell you either. She looked up. The day I pulled Judge Grace out of that burning building. I remember thinking it might be the last thing I ever did. I'd taken the call on my day off. I was supposed to be at a parent-teacher conference with Ellie's mom, but I went anyway, and I've carried that choice ever since. Mara tilted her head. Do you regret it? No, he said softly, because it led me here, to this. She touched his arm, firm but gentle. You saved someone that day, and you saved someone again when you opened your door. Luke didn't speak, but in the way he looked at her, it was clear something old had finally healed. That evening, the cabin glowed with a quiet, golden warmth. The girls had fallen asleep early, their cheeks flushed with cold and happiness. Mara and Luke sat on the couch, the fire flickering low. She turned to him. What happens next? Luke studied the flame. We live. We make dinners, and do homework, and fix leaky pipes. Maybe build a garden come spring. Mara smiled. A garden? He shrugged. Ellie wants to try growing carrots. I said she was crazy. She said she'd prove me wrong. She leaned her head on his shoulder just enough to feel the quiet thump of his heart. Sounds like the beginning of something, she murmured. Luke placed his hand over hers. It already is. The snow had begun to melt in patches, exposing dark, damp soil beneath the whiteness, as though the earth was remembering itself again. With the thaw came a hush of anticipation, of something new trying to grow in silence. Inside the cabin, the fire still burned, but lighter coats now hung by the door. Boots still tracked mud, but not as deep. The air smelled faintly of pine and cinnamon, and Luke noticed the mornings no longer felt like weight, they felt like invitation. Mara had taken to scribbling notes in a small leather-bound journal, grocery lists, garden plans, a sketch of a window with curtains she wanted to sew. It was a quiet rebellion against the instability that once defined her days. Luke never asked what she wrote. He only made sure there was always a pen within reach. One morning, Luke found Mara sitting at the kitchen table with the photograph Judge Grace had handed him. Her fingers traced the image gently like it was something sacred. She didn't know your name, Mara said. Luke nodded. I never gave it. Why, he sat across from her coffee steaming between them. Because it wasn't about me. I wasn't looking for anything. Not then. And now he met her eyes. Now I see what a name can carry. She folded the photograph, slid it into the back of her journal. I think she came to that hearing for more than justice. Luke tilted his head. What do you mean I think she needed to find you? Not just legally, personally. She needed to thank the person who gave her life back. Luke was quiet for a moment. She saved us too, he said finally. That afternoon, Mara drove into town alone for the first time since the court case ended. She returned with groceries, a small box of seeds, and an envelope she didn't open until the girls were in bed. Luke found her on the porch, envelope in hand, worry pinched into the lines around her mouth. What is it? He asked. She held it out. It's a follow-up from the court. Not a summons, just paperwork, finalization. He took the envelope, but didn't open it. Instead, he sat beside her and waited. I thought I'd feel relieved, she whispered, like I could finally breathe. But I'm scared. I don't know what comes next. Not with the girls, not with you, not even with me. Luke set the envelope down and reached for her hand. You don't have to know, he said. We'll figure it out as we go. Isn't that what we've been doing all along? She looked at him, eyes searching. But what if I mess it up? What if I let all of this slip through my fingers? You won't, he said, steady as ever. Because you know what it costs to lose. And you know how to fight for what matters. Her eyes welled, but she didn't cry. Instead, she leaned forward and kissed his cheek, light tentative, like a question asked without words. He didn't move. Then gently he turned his head and kissed her softly, slowly, as though they had all the time in the world. And maybe they did. That night, after the fire had burned low and the girls were fast asleep, Mara opened the envelope. Inside was a notarized letter confirming full legal custody. It was simple, stark. But at the bottom in blue ink was a note handwritten by Judge Eleanor Grace. Sometimes the law upholds what the heart already knows. May this new beginning bring you peace, not because it erases the past, but because it honors it. Mara read it twice, then tucked it behind the photograph in her journal. She didn't wake Luke to tell him. Instead, she lay beside him, their hands loosely intertwined, and let the weight of fear slide off her shoulders like a coat she no longer needed. The following Sunday, Luke brought the girls out to the open field behind the cabin. It was muddy and uneven, scattered with dead brush, but in his mind, it was the start of something new. We're planting carrots, Ellie asked, skeptical. Eventually, Luke said, but first we clear space, one step at a time. The girls got to work pulling up old roots. Mara arrived moments later with seed packets and gloves. She didn't ask what they were doing. She just joined in. And in the late afternoon light, as the sun spilled over 5 people working side by side in muddy boots and laughter, Luke looked around and felt a sensation he couldn't name at first. It wasn't joy, exactly, or relief. It was home. Not the place, the people. And he knew without needing to say it that everything had shifted. That evening, as they cleaned up for dinner, Mara paused by the fireplace, looking at the framed photo of Luke in uniform, the only one he'd ever let someone take before he left the department. You ever think about going back? She asked. To firefighting. She nodded. Luke shook his head. Not to fight flames, but maybe to teach, help train others. I've been thinking about it. She smiled. I think you'd be good at that. He looked at her, his eyes soft. And what would you do if you could do anything? Mara paused, considered. Then with quiet conviction said, I'd stay. Spring arrived quietly in Cold Springs, not with fanfare, but with soft thaws and longer afternoons. The creek behind the cabin trickled where ice had once choked it. Buds emerged timidly on bare branches. The world, it seemed, was learning how to begin again. Inside the cabin, change was subtler, but no less real. Ellie had started leaving her drawings on the refrigerator. June no longer asked each night if they'd still be there in the morning. Leah had taken to reading aloud, not just listening, and Mara had stopped flinching at the sound of mail landing in the box. Luke stood on the porch one Saturday morning, sipping coffee, as the girls dug in the plot of turned soil they now called a garden. It wasn't much, just a few hopeful lines in the dirt, but watching them plan, argue, and imagine together was worth more than a dozen perfect rows. Mara joined him with a quiet sigh, her eyes fixed on the horizon. "They're growing roots," she said softly. "So are we," Luke replied. She smiled but didn't look away. "I've been thinking about something." "Yeah, I want to go back to school." Luke blinked. Yeah. I never finished. Life got in the way. Then the kids, then survival." She turned toward him. "But now I want to do more than survive." Luke leaned against the railing, thoughtful. "What would you study? Social work, maybe? Or early childhood development? Something that helps people who've been through what I've been through. Someone was there for me when I needed it. Judge Grace Harlan, you. Maybe it's my turn." Luke smiled, the kind that reached deep. "I think you'd be incredible. I don't want to stop being a mother to do it," she added quickly. "I just want to be more of myself again, too." He reached out and tucked a loose strand of hair behind her ear. "You won't have to do it alone." That evening, Mara and the girls baked cornbread, while Luke replaced a few loose shingles on the roof. When he came back inside, the smell of butter and rosemary hit him like a memory he hadn't lived yet. Warm. Real. Waiting. At dinner, Ellie raised a toast with her plastic cup of apple juice. "To the garden," she declared. "To cornbread," June added. "To staying," Leah whispered. Mara looked at Luke across the table. Her eyes glistened, but her smile was steady. "To family," she said. After the girls had gone to bed, Luke lit a lantern and pulled out a weathered box from beneath the bench near the fireplace. Mara sat beside him, curious. He opened it slowly. Inside was a collection of things that didn't look like they belonged together. An old photo of a fire crew, a medal still pinned to velvet, the scorched red handkerchief folded neatly in a plastic sleeve. "I've been carrying this box through every season of my life," Luke said. "Not just physically. Up here, too." He tapped his temple. Mara ran her fingers lightly across the photo. "That's you." "Yeah. The one in the back row. Just before everything changed." She looked up. "Do you regret it?" "Some days," he admitted. "But not the fire, not the job, just not knowing what it would all lead to. I thought I'd lost my chance at anything good." She took the handkerchief in her hands like something fragile. "But you didn't." "No," he said. "Because you knocked on the right door." She looked at him for a long time, then back at the box. "You ever think about letting it go?" Luke didn't answer right away. He took the medal and laid it beside the photo, then closed the box again. "I think maybe it's time," he said. "Not to forget, but to move forward." She placed her hand over his. "That's all any of us ever really need." Days turned into weeks. Mara enrolled in evening classes at the community college, and Luke signed up to assist with firefighter training sessions twice a month. The cabin no longer felt like a place people landed. It felt like a place people belonged. One Sunday afternoon, a familiar sedan pulled up the drive. Eleanor Grace stepped out, her scarf fluttering in the breeze, a paper bag in her arms. "I brought scones," she announced. Mara met her halfway down the path. "You didn't have to." "I wanted to see the garden," the judge said, smiling. Luke invited her inside. Over warm scones and laughter, the woman who had once stood between them and disaster now sat with flour on her blouse, a child in her lap, and no bench to hide behind. "You were right, you know," Mara said later as she walked Eleanor to her car. "About what? That the law can't always define what's right." Eleanor paused, her smile soft. Sometimes we're just lucky enough to recognize it when it shows up on our doorstep. That night, after the dishes were done and the girls tucked in, Luke and Mara sat out beneath the stars. No crisis, no paperwork, no verdicts. Just two people who had walked through fires, different years, and met on the other side. Mara leaned her head on his shoulder. "You think it's possible?" she asked. "What that broken things can still become whole." Luke wrapped an arm around her, pulling her closer. "Not just possible," he whispered. "I think it's already happening." The first true spring rain came in the middle of the night. It fell steady and soft, drumming lightly on the tin roof above the cabin and soaking into the thawed earth like a benediction. In the morning, the air smelled like moss and memory. It smelled like life moving forward. Luke rose early as always. He stood by the window in his flannel shirt and watched the rain trace slow rivers down the glass. Behind him, the quiet hum of the kettle whispered of habit, of comfort of home. The floor creaked softly. Mara. She appeared barefoot, hair still tousled from sleep, wrapped in one of his old sweatshirts. "Didn't mean to wake you," he said, pouring her coffee. "You didn't," she murmured. The rain did. They stood side by side at the window, mugs in hand, watching the world soften. "Do you remember the first time we stood here?" she asked. He nodded. "You were soaked through, holding June like she might disappear, and you looked like someone who hadn't let himself care in a long time." Luke chuckled softly. "I hadn't." Mara leaned her head on his shoulder. And now he looked down at her, the lines around his eyes deepening with warmth. "Now I can't imagine not caring." Later that morning, the girls set the table for breakfast. 5 plates, 5 cups, and in the center, a jar of wildflowers Mara and Ellie had picked 2 days before. The table, once dusty and half used, now felt full in every way that mattered. As they sat down to eat, Luke looked around and let himself truly see what he had once feared he'd never have again: a family. Not a replacement. Not a second attempt. A real, hard-won, imperfect, beautiful family. He raised his mug to muddy boots, burnt toast, and garden rows that probably won't grow straight. The girls giggled. Mara raised her mug too, to starting over, and staying in one place long enough to finish something. Ellie, not to be outdone, chimed in, to not being afraid anymore. There was a beat of quiet, a soft, reverent stillness. Luke's eyes met Mara's, and together they smiled. That afternoon, Mara took a walk into town alone with her coat open and her head held high. She picked up textbooks from the college bookstore, grabbed lunch at a diner, and even sat at the park bench, where she used to pause during the hardest months of her wandering. She no longer felt like a shadow of someone who had survived. She felt like someone building something with both hands and a steady heart. At the hardware store, she ran into Judge Grace. The older woman smiled as she stepped out of her car, umbrella in hand. "You look like you belong here," she said. Mara laughed. "That's because I do." Eleanor handed her a slip of paper. "My daughter graduates from college next month. I'd love if you and the girls came." Mara took the invitation with both hands. "I'd be honored," she said, then added, "And if you ever want cornbread again, you know where to find us." Eleanor leaned in and whispered, "Your story reminded me why I do this. Thank you for living it out loud." Back at the cabin, Luke and Ellie were fixing the fence. Or rather, Ellie was handing him tools and making commentary about how much more efficient this would be if they just got a goat instead. "You just want a goat because Mara promised you could name it," Luke teased. "Exactly," Ellie grinned. "I'm thinking Captain Crumbles." Luke laughed, the kind of full chest-deep laugh that he hadn't let out in years. Later, when Mara returned and the sun dipped behind the trees, he pulled her aside. "I was thinking," he said. "It's been a long time since I built something from the ground up." She raised an eyebrow. "The fence looks fine to me." He shook his head. pulled something from his back pocket. A small wooden box, hand-carved. Simple. Inside a ring. "I don't have speeches," he said. "Just this: I love the way you walk through a room like it's yours. I love how the girls reach for your hand without thinking. I love how you made this place warmer just by being here." He paused. "I don't need papers to call us a family. But if you'll let me, I'd like to give you my name, this time freely. Openly." Mara blinked, stunned but smiling. "You sure?" she whispered. "You already have so much." Luke nodded. "I don't want more. I want you." Tears welled, but she didn't look away. "Then yes," she said. 1,000 times. Yes. That night, 5 chairs circled the dinner table. One for a girl who had found her voice. One for a child who stopped asking if they were leaving. One for a sister who finally slept soundly. One for a woman who chose to stay. And one for the man who opened his door and found his life again. No judge needed to rule. No jury needed to vote. Because love, quiet, kind, and true, had written its own verdict. And it was enough. Sometimes the most extraordinary stories begin with the simplest gesture. A door opened on a cold night, a name spoken in a courtroom, a family quietly forming around a kitchen table. If this story touched your heart, I'd love to hear where you're watching from. Let us know in the comments. You never know who might be listening or who might need a little hope today. And if you'd like to hear more stories like this, real healing and quietly powerful, feel free to subscribe. It means the world. Thank you truly for spending your time here with me. Until next time, stay warm, stay kind, and never underestimate the power of opening your heart. Just a little.